Sybil Ludington was 16 years old when history placed responsibility on her shoulders without warning. It was the spring of 1777, during the American Revolutionary Era, when survival depended on speed, memory, and courage carried through darkness. Raised in colonial New York inside the home of militia commander Colonel Henry Ludington, Sybil grew up surrounded by war plans, urgent conversations, and the quiet tension of a nation fighting to exist. She was not raised for fame or recognition, only for duty. At 16, she stood at the fragile boundary between childhood and adulthood, aware of danger but unshielded from it. While generals prepared strategies and soldiers prepared weapons, an ordinary teenage girl remained unseen by official records. On one storm-filled night, when time collapsed and fear spread faster than words, Sybil Ludington would step forward. Before the ride began, before history noticed, she was simply 16. And ready. In 1777, when Sybil Ludington was 16 years old, the American colonies were fighting a war they were not yet sure they could survive. The Revolutionary Era was defined by uncertainty, where British forces controlled cities, supply lines were fragile, and information moved only as fast as a rider could travel. There were no telegraphs, no signals, and no guarantees of safety after nightfall. Colonial militias depended entirely on warnings delivered by word of mouth, often through forests, rain, and enemy territory. For families like the Ludingtons in rural New York, war was not distant news, it lived outside their doors. At 16, Sybil watched this fragile system closely, understanding that timing meant everything. One missed message could destroy an entire region's defense. In this world, speed replaced strength, courage replaced numbers, and ordinary civilians carried the fate of resistance on narrow dirt roads. Sybil Ludington was born on April 5, 1761, in Fredericksburg, New York, during a time when loyalty to the British Crown was already beginning to fracture. She entered the world more than a decade before independence was declared, in a colonial society shaped by farms, faith, and growing unrest. Her early childhood unfolded quietly, surrounded by forests, dirt roads, and tightly knit communities that relied on one another for survival. Yet beneath this calm surface, political tension steadily increased. As Sybil grew from infancy into early childhood, arguments over taxation, authority, and freedom spread through taverns and homes alike. The revolution did not begin with gunfire for her generation, it began with conversations overheard and changes slowly felt. These first years formed her sense of place and belonging. Long before she understood war, Sybil Ludington was already growing up inside the conditions that would one day demand courage. Between the ages of 6 and 9, Sybil Ludington's world expanded beyond childhood routine and into responsibility shaped by war. Her father, Colonel Henry Ludington, commanded the local militia in colonial New York, turning their home into a place of constant movement and quiet urgency. Officers arrived on horseback, maps were spread across tables, and decisions were made that could affect entire communities. Sybil watched from doorways and corners, absorbing far more than she was taught. She learned when to stay silent, when to listen, and how tension felt before words explained it. The Revolutionary Era was no longer distant conversation, it lived inside her household. While other children played freely, Sybil grew accustomed to discipline, order, and awareness. These years did not train her for heroism, but they shaped her instincts. Long before action was required, responsibility had already become familiar. Between the ages of 10 and 13, Sybil Ludington began developing the practical skills that quietly shaped her independence. Life in rural colonial New York required children to mature early, and Sybil learned through daily routine rather than formal instruction. She became comfortable on horseback, riding familiar paths across farmland and wooded roads, learning distance, balance, and direction through repetition. She watched adults manage responsibilities, listened carefully, and remembered what mattered. In the American Revolutionary Era, awareness was a form of preparation, even when no one named it as such. Sybil learned how weather changed roads, how daylight faded quickly in the countryside, and how silence often carried meaning. These years were calm, steady, and unremarkable on the surface. Yet beneath them, capability was forming naturally. Long before history required action, Sybil Ludington was already learning how to move confidently through her world. By the ages of 14 and 15, Sybil Ludington was no longer a child, yet not fully an adult, living in a society that rarely acknowledged girls beyond the household. The American Revolutionary era was shaped by men in uniform, but its pressures reached every family. In rural New York, expectations were clear and limited, even as responsibilities quietly expanded. Sybil moved through daily life with growing awareness, understanding boundaries while learning where strength was required. She observed how decisions were made, how silence carried weight, and how preparation often happened without instruction. There was no announcement of purpose, only routine shaped by necessity. As war tightened around communities, maturity arrived naturally. At 15, Sybil Ludington stood steady within a changing world, shaped by observation rather than command. She was not being trained for history, yet history was already shaping her, one quiet day at a time. In the spring of 1777, when Sybil Ludington was 15 going on 16, the war she had observed quietly for years suddenly became immediate. British forces threatened Danbury, a Patriot supply depot, and the surrounding towns of colonial New York faced the danger directly. News traveled slowly, often carried only by horseback riders through forests and hills. Every family, every home, every child living in these communities understood that the safety of neighbors and militia alike depended on vigilance. For Sybil, the lessons of her early years, the hours spent observing maps, learning horse riding, and understanding her father's militia operations, suddenly took on meaning. The war was no longer distant, it was outside her window, in the roads and hills, pressing against the lives of ordinary people. At 15, she faced the moment where preparation met necessity, a quiet readiness for an extraordinary act yet to come. On a storm-darkened night in April 1777, 16-year-old Sybil Ludington faced a moment that would define her life. British troops were advancing on Danbury, threatening the Patriot supply depot, and the scattered militia needed immediate warning. No riders were available. The responsibility fell to her. Years of observing her father's militia, learning the roads, and understanding timing had prepared her quietly. Mounting her horse, she became a lone messenger in the darkness, navigating forests and hills under rain and wind. Each mile demanded endurance, focus, and calm judgment. Sybil did not hesitate. She did not consider fame or recognition. Her duty was clear, and she rode. That night, the ordinary became extraordinary, and a teenage girl carried the weight of her community on horseback, becoming one of the Revolution's unsung heroes. As the night deepened, 16-year-old Sybil Ludington mounted her horse and stepped into the darkness, carrying the weight of responsibility for her community. Rain slicked the roads, wind whipped through the trees, and shadows moved across the muddy forest paths, yet she pressed forward with quiet determination. Years of observing her father's militia, memorizing local routes, and riding across fields had prepared her for this moment. Sybil was not a soldier. She carried no weapons, only a message that could save hundreds. Each mile demanded focus, endurance, and calm judgment as she navigated twists in the path and obstacles hidden by night. Her mind balanced speed with caution, knowing that delay could cost lives. Alone, soaked, and vigilant, 16-year-old Sybil rode tirelessly, becoming the vital link between danger and preparation. That night, ordinary courage transformed into extraordinary action, proving that a single determined teenager could change the course of history. The storm pressed in as 16-year-old Sybil Ludington rode through the dark New York countryside. Rain drenched her cloak, wind bent the trees, and shadows turned familiar paths into challenges. Each step of her horse required careful attention, every turn tested her focus. Alone in the night, she relied on memory, instinct, and the lessons from her father's militia household. Fallen branches, muddy roads, and swollen streams demanded calm judgment. Sybil was not a soldier. She carried only the urgent message that would alert nearly 400 militia members. Every mile weighed heavily on her, yet her determination never wavered. Guided by responsibility rather than fame, 16-year-old Sybil pressed forward through the relentless storm, becoming a vital link between danger and preparation. That night, ordinary courage became extraordinary, and a teenage girl transformed necessity into history, one careful mile at a time. 16-year-old Sybil Ludington began her 40-mile midnight ride through the dark, rain-slicked roads of New York. Storm clouds pressed down, wind moved through the trees, and mud slowed her horse, turning familiar paths into challenges. Every step required focus as she navigated puddles, roots, and uneven ground. Years of observing her father's militia had prepared her for this night. Alone, she carried the urgent message to alert nearly 400 militia members, knowing every mile mattered. Rain soaked her cloak, but determination kept her steady. Each turn tested endurance and attention, yet she pressed forward with calm purpose. That night, ordinary courage became extraordinary. 16-year-old Sybil Ludington transformed duty into action, proving that a single determined teenager could guide her community through danger and etch her name into history. Halfway through her 40-mile midnight ride, 16-year-old Sybil Ludington faced the full force of the storm. Rain fell steadily, wind shook the trees, and darkness swallowed familiar paths, yet she continued without hesitation. Each mile tested her endurance, as mud, fallen branches, and streams demanded careful navigation. Years of observation and riding practice guided her through the obstacles. Alone in the night, she carried the urgent message to alert the scattered militia, knowing the safety of neighbors depended on her. Every turn required focus, every decision mattered. Despite exhaustion, determination kept her moving forward, balancing caution with speed. History had not yet recognized her, but she pressed on, proving that courage was not measured by age. 16-year-old Sybil Ludington transformed a stormy night into a mission of extraordinary responsibility, demonstrating that even a teenager could rise to meet the demands of her community and of history itself. As the midnight ride neared its final miles, 16-year-old Sybil Ludington pushed forward through the relentless storm. Rain soaked her cloak and hair, wind rattled the trees, and the muddy roads slowed her horse, yet she remained focused. Each turn brought new obstacles. Fallen branches, swollen streams, and uneven terrain demanded attention and calm judgment. Alone in the darkness, she carried the urgent message that could mobilize nearly 400 militia members. Every mile tested endurance and resolve, yet determination kept her moving steadily. The night pressed on, and fatigue weighed heavily, but Sybil's sense of duty outweighed fear or exhaustion. History had yet to acknowledge her, but she acted with unwavering courage. 16-year-old Sybil Ludington transformed a dangerous stormy night into a mission of vital importance, proving that a single teenage girl could safeguard her community and etch her place in history. As dawn approached, 16-year-old Sybil Ludington neared the scattered militia outposts. Rain still fell, the roads were muddy, and the night storm had left branches and debris in her path, yet she remained unwavering. Every town, every farmhouse she passed carried the hope of an alert, and her message would determine the response of nearly 400 militia members. Her endurance and focus were tested with each mile, but her sense of duty guided every action. Alone, soaked, and exhausted, Sybil rode through the early morning darkness, her courage quiet but undeniable. By delivering the warning, she ensured that the militia could prepare, respond, and protect the community from British forces. That night, 16-year-old Sybil Ludington transformed ordinary responsibility into heroic action, proving that determination and bravery, even in a teenager, could alter the course of history. After the midnight ride, Sybil Ludington, now 16, returned to her daily life with quiet determination. Locally, families and militia members recognized her courage, though her story did not spread widely beyond the community. Even George Washington reportedly acknowledged her bravery in private correspondence, a fleeting honor in a time when young women's actions were rarely celebrated. Sybil understood that heroism was not always rewarded with fame. She carried her memory of the night with humility, reflecting on the weight of responsibility and the trust placed in her. Though others would forget, she remained steady, grounded, and conscientious. 16-year-old Sybil Ludington had faced a storm, delivered a vital warning, and inspired courage in her neighbors. Her recognition was quiet but meaningful, a reminder that true heroism does not seek applause and that courage often exists in those who act without expectation of reward. In her early 20s, Sybil Ludington transitioned from local hero to everyday life. The extraordinary night of her midnight ride receded into memory as she married and focused on family. Days were filled with domestic work, raising children, and managing household responsibilities, a sharp contrast to the courage and urgency of her teenage years. Yet the lessons of responsibility, calm under pressure, and steadfastness remained with her. Friends and neighbors remembered her bravery, though public recognition was limited. She lived quietly, balancing ordinary life with the knowledge that she had once carried her community's hopes through storm and darkness. In these years, Sybil's heroism became personal strength, shaping her character and guiding her actions. Even in the ordinary rhythm of daily life, the courage she demonstrated as a teenager continued to influence those around her, a quiet but lasting legacy. Throughout her 30s to 60s, Sybil Ludington lived a life largely removed from public attention. Her days were filled with family, managing her household, and engaging quietly with her community. The extraordinary courage of her youth remained a personal memory, shared only with close friends and family, while the wider world largely forgot her deeds. Time passed gently, and her life followed the steady rhythm of domestic responsibility and routine. Yet the lessons of her teenage heroism, calm under pressure, steadfastness, and courage, continued to shape her character and interactions. Though history overlooked her at the time, she remained dignified and reflective, carrying her experiences with quiet pride. In the shadows of ordinary life, Sybil Ludington embodied resilience, proving that heroism is not always recognized publicly, and that a life of steadfast purpose, lived quietly, is itself a form of lasting significance. In 1839, Sybil Ludington passed away at the age of 77, largely forgotten by the wider world. The girl who had once ridden through storms to warn her community of danger had lived a long, quiet life, her heroism known only to family and a few neighbors. She had spent decades raising children, managing her household, and contributing quietly to her community, embodying resilience and steadfastness. Though public recognition was absent, her life left an enduring mark on those who knew her personally. Sybil's death was met with respect and sorrow in her local circle, but history would largely overlook her story for decades. In the final chapter of her life, she remained dignified and calm, a reminder that courage is not always celebrated in its time, and that the true measure of heroism can exist quietly, without fame, in the life of someone who acts with purpose and integrity. Decades after her death, Sybil Ludington's story slowly returned to public memory. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, historians and organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution began documenting her midnight ride. Monuments were placed, markers installed, and her name entered local histories. At the same time, scholars examined records carefully, debating details and separating documented fact from later embellishment. This scrutiny did not diminish her courage. Instead, it grounded her story in historical reality. Sybil Ludington emerged not as legend, but as an example of civilian responsibility during a moment of crisis. Her rediscovery revealed how history often overlooks ordinary individuals whose actions carry lasting importance. Through research, debate, and remembrance, Sybil's legacy was restored thoughtfully, honoring what can be proven while respecting the quiet bravery of a teenage girl who acted when her community needed her most. Sybil Ludington matters not because her story is dramatic, but because it is human. She was not a general, a politician, or a public leader. She was a civilian who acted when responsibility demanded it. At 16, she carried a warning through darkness and danger, not for glory, but for her community. Her life reminds us that courage does not require permission, rank, or recognition. It often appears quietly, in moments when ordinary people choose responsibility over fear. Sybil's story challenges how history measures importance, urging us to value action as much as acclaim. Her legacy endures because it reflects a truth that transcends time. Meaningful change often begins with individuals who step forward when others cannot. In remembering Sybil Ludington, we honor not only one ride, but the enduring power of quiet courage, civic duty, and the strength found in ordinary lives.